The makeshift camp for German civilians on the outskirts of Hamburg had been established in the chaotic summer of 1945, one of hundreds of similar facilities across occupied Germany, where Allied authorities attempted to process and house the millions of displaced persons who had survived the war but had nowhere to go. The camp housed mostly women and children, families whose men had been killed or captured, refugees who had fled the Soviet advance from the east, people who had lost their homes to bombing, and who now depended entirely on Allied supplies for survival. Among these civilians were approximately 30 children, ranging from toddlers to teenagers, most of them showing the visible effects of prolonged malnutrition. Thin limbs, distended bellies, dull hair, the physical markers of bodies that had not received adequate nutrition for months or years. The British military government unit responsible for the camp's administration faced the enormous challenge of feeding these civilians from military supplies stretched thin across occupied Germany, of providing adequate nutrition to people whose bodies had been damaged by sustained hunger, of doing so within the constraints of regulations and resources that seemed inadequate to the task's scale. The children in the camp had grown accustomed to hunger as a constant presence in their lives, a gnawing emptiness that never quite disappeared even when they received the minimal rations that kept them alive but provided nothing approaching adequate nutrition. They had learned to view food not as something to be enjoyed or taken for granted, but rather as a scarce resource to be consumed immediately and completely, without waste, without the luxury of preferences or pickiness. Many had forgotten what it felt like to be truly full, to eat not just until the acute pangs of hunger subsided, but until their bodies were actually satisfied and nourished. The rations provided by British authorities were calculated to prevent starvation, but not to restore health, determined by bureaucratic formulas that balanced humanitarian concerns against resource constraints and against political pressures from British civilians who questioned why enemy populations should receive food while rationing continued at home. It was in this context that a British Army cook named Sergeant William Davies was stationed with the military government unit managing the camp, made a decision that violated regulations, but that he justified as necessary given what he observed daily among the children. Davies had been a cook in civilian life before the war, had operated a small restaurant in Wales, and had developed strong opinions about food and nutrition that went beyond the mechanical requirements of military food service. He had watched the German children in the camp eating their minimal rations with a desperate intensity that troubled him, had seen how they approached every meal as if it might be their last, had noticed the way they hoarded scraps and refused to leave anything on their plates no matter how unappetizing. The official rations provided to German civilians, bread, thin soup, use occasionally some vegetables or small amounts of preserved meat, were adequate to prevent death, but insufficient to promote recovery or growth in children whose bodies desperately needed nutrition. Davies decided, without seeking official authorization because he knew it would be denied, to prepare a large batch of oat porridge for the camp's children one morning in late July. Oats were available in military stores, and porridge was a staple of British military rations, cheap and filling, if not particularly exciting. But Davies prepared the porridge, not according to military specifications, which produced a thin, barely sweetened gruel, but rather the way he would have made it for paying customers in his restaurant, thick and properly cooked, when with liberal amounts of tinned milk and sugar that he diverted from officers' rations without permission. He understood he was risking disciplinary action, that using military supplies to provide German civilians with food beyond their authorized rations violated regulations designed to prevent favoritism and to ensure equitable distribution of scarce resources. But Davies had decided that feeding hungry children trumped regulations, that he would rather face punishment than watch children go inadequately fed when he had the means to provide them something better. When Davies brought the large pot of porridge to the area where the children received their meals, accompanied by a German-speaking refugee who worked as a translator in the camp, the children's initial reaction was wariness rather than excitement, and they had learned through hard experience that anything new or unexpected was more likely to be threatening than beneficial, that changes in routine often meant reductions in already inadequate rations or new restrictions rather than improvements. The translator explained that this was a special meal, that the British cook had made them proper porridge, that they should eat as much as they wanted. The children approached cautiously, receiving bowls filled with the thick, creamy porridge that bore no resemblance to the thin soups and watery gruels that typically constituted their meals. What happened next became a story that Davies would tell for the rest of his life, a moment that crystallized for him something about the war's human cost that no amount of destruction or combat casualties had quite conveyed. And the first child to taste the porridge, a girl of perhaps 7 whose name Davies never learned, took a tentative spoonful, her expression showing the caution of someone expecting disappointment or worse. Then her face transformed in a way that suggested she couldn't quite process what she was experiencing. She took another spoonful, faster, then another, and suddenly she was eating with desperate intensity, shoveling the porridge into her mouth as if afraid it would disappear or be taken away. Other children, seeing her reaction, began eating their own portions with similar urgency, their faces showing a mixture of disbelief and something close to joy as they encountered food that was not just adequate for survival, but actually good, actually nourishing, actually satisfying in a way they had forgotten food could be. But what shocked Davies most profoundly was what happened after the initial frantic eating slowed. Several of the younger children began to cry. Not the tears of distress or pain that Davies had seen often enough among the camp's population, but rather tears that seemed to come from some deeper well of emotion, from the overwhelming experience of having a fundamental need met in a way that went beyond mere survival. One boy, perhaps 8 years old, looked up at Davies with tears streaming down his face and spoke in German that the translator rendered as, "I didn't remember that food could taste like this." Another child asked through the translator whether the porridge was real, whether this was actually happening, or whether she was dreaming or imagining it. The question wasn't whimsical, but desperately sincere, reflecting a psychological state where deprivation had become so normalized that adequate nourishment seemed like something from a different reality, something that couldn't possibly be real in the world these children inhabited. Davies found himself profoundly shaken by the children's reactions, by the visible evidence of what sustained malnutrition had done, not just to their bodies, but to their entire relationship with food and with basic human needs. These children had been taught by their experience that hunger was permanent, that satisfaction was impossible, that food was a scarce resource that prevented death but provided nothing more. The simple experience of eating good porridge until they were actually full had overwhelmed them because it violated everything their recent lives had taught them to expect. And Davies had thought he was just providing a decent meal, but he had inadvertently given the children something more profound, a reminder that there could be such a thing as enough, that food could be more than desperate fuel, that the constant gnawing hunger that defined their existence was not actually inevitable or permanent. The immediate aftermath of the porridge meal involved practical complications that Davies hadn't fully anticipated. Some of the younger children, whose stomachs had shrunk and adapted to minimal food intake, became ill from eating too much too quickly, experiencing the discomfort of suddenly full bellies after months of constant emptiness. The camp's British medical officer had to be called to treat several children whose bodies couldn't handle the sudden abundance. A situation that was simultaneously comedic in its absurdity and tragic in what it revealed about the children's physical condition. Davies faced a reprimand from his commanding officer for exceeding authorized rations and diverting supplies without permission, though the reprimand was relatively mild and seemed to acknowledge that while regulations had been violated, the underlying impulse had been decent. More significantly, the porridge incident created a problem of expectations and sustainability. The children now knew that food could be something other than the minimal rations they received, that the British had access to provisions that could satisfy rather than just prevent starvation. They began asking when there would be more porridge, whether the good food had been a one-time event or whether it represented a change in how they would be fed. The translator who had assisted Davies reported that parents in the camp were asking similar questions, some with hope that British policy might be changing, others with cynicism that the porridge had been a cruel tease that made the return to minimal rations even harder to bear. Davies wanted to provide the better food regularly, but lacked both the authority and the resources to do so within the constraints of his position and the military government's supply system. The incident forced Davies to confront uncomfortable truths about the occupation's food policies and about the broader question of how Allied authorities should treat German civilians who were technically enemies, but who were also human beings suffering from the war's consequences. The regulations that limited German civilian rations were justified partly by resource constraints. There genuinely wasn't enough food in occupied Germany to provide everyone with adequate nutrition, but also by political and psychological factors. British civilians, still enduring rationing years after victory, questioned why resources should flow to Germans who had supported the Nazi regime and who bore responsibility for the war that had created these food shortages. And military authorities worried that being too generous to German civilians would create resentment among Allied troops and would undermine the message that Germany had lost the war and must face consequences for its aggression. Yet Davies, confronting the reality of hungry children whose culpability for the war was difficult to defend, found these justifications increasingly inadequate. The children eating porridge and crying because they had forgotten food could taste good were not Nazi ideologues or war criminals, but rather victims of decisions made by adults in power structures they hadn't controlled. The logic that held them collectively responsible for Germany's actions, and therefore deserving of minimal support, seemed to Davies both cruel and counterproductive. Starving children today would become damaged adults tomorrow, and perpetuating cycles of resentment and suffering that would undermine any hope for Germany's democratic reconstruction. His individual act of providing better food couldn't solve systemic problems, but it represented a recognition that regulations and policies existed in tension with moral obligations that sometimes demanded violations of official rules. The story of the porridge and the children's reactions spread through the British military government unit, creating division between those who felt Davies had done the right thing and those who maintained he had violated necessary regulations and created unsustainable expectations. Some officers began quietly providing additional food to children when they could do so without detection, creating an unofficial policy that deviated from official regulations, but that reflected genuine humanitarian impulses. Others insisted that rules existed for good reasons and that individual deviations, however well-intentioned, undermined the systematic approach that military government required. The debate represented broader tensions within the occupation about how to balance justice, security, and humanitarian concerns in dealing with defeated enemy populations. For the children themselves, the porridge incident became a memory that many would carry for the rest of their lives, though its meaning varied. Some remembered it as the moment when they first understood that the war had truly ended, that the constant hunger that had defined their existence might eventually diminish, and others recalled it as a cruel reminder of what they had lost, a glimpse of normal life that made their continued deprivation harder to endure. A few, interviewed decades later by historians researching civilian experiences of occupation, spoke about how the British cook's kindness had challenged their assumptions about enemies, about how the simple act of providing good food had humanized British occupation forces in a way that official policies and propaganda could not. Davies himself reflected on the incident in letters home to his wife, struggling to explain what it meant that children could cry from the experience of eating adequate food, trying to articulate the profound wrongness of a world where such crying made sense. He wrote about how the war had taught him to see death and destruction as somehow normal, how he had become desensitized to violence and loss, but that the children's tears over porridge had broken through that desensitization and forced him to feel the war's human cost in a visceral way that combat had somehow not achieved. The letter suggested a man grappling with moral questions that his military training had not prepared him to address, questions about responsibility and complicity and the obligations that victors owed to the defeated. The long-term impact of incidents like Davies's porridge provision on occupation food policy is difficult to trace, but the gradual improvement in German civilian rations over 1945 and 1946 reflected growing recognition among Allied authorities that minimal subsistence feeding was both morally problematic and politically counterproductive. And the Marshall Plan's eventual implementation would provide resources on a scale that made Davies's pot of porridge seem trivial, but the underlying recognition was similar, that treating defeated populations with sustained harshness created conditions for future conflict rather than for lasting peace. The children who cried over porridge in summer 1945 would grow up in a Germany that, despite its division and occupation, would receive investment and support that enabled recovery rather than perpetuating punishment. Whether they connected their eventual prosperity to a British cook's violation of regulations on a July morning is unknowable, but both reflected decisions about what obligations victors owed to the defeated and about whether cycles of suffering could be broken through choices that prioritized humanity over strict justice.